March 8, 1944, RAF Debden, England. Major George Preddy watched as his crew chief drained 85 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel from his P-51B Mustang and replaced it with something the technical manual explicitly forbade. The liquid pooling in the collection drums looked identical, smelled identical, but the specifications painted on the replacement barrels told a different story. 150-octane fuel, the kind reserved for emergencies, the kind that could push a Packard Merlin engine beyond its designed limits, the kind that, according to every engineering bulletin from Wright Field, would destroy cylinder heads and burn through exhaust valves after sustained use. Preddy ran his hand along the Mustang's cowling. In 6 hours, he'd be at 28,000 feet over Germany, with this experimental mixture coursing through his engine. If the engineers were right, he'd be limping home on 3 cylinders, if he made it home at all. If they were wrong, if the whispered rumors from a handful of 8th Air Force squadrons running unauthorized tests proved true, he'd have an advantage that would change everything. His crew chief looked up from the fuel panel, wrench still in hand. "Major, you sure about this? Wright Field says..." "Wright Field isn't getting bounced by Focke-Wulfs at 30,000 feet. Preddy cut him off. The tech order was clear. Emergency war power settings only. 5 minutes maximum. Never in sustained combat. What American fighter pilots were about to prove over the skies of Germany would rewrite every performance chart, every tactical bulletin, and every assumption about what the Merlin engine could actually survive. And it would cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of pilots who thought they knew exactly how fast a Mustang could climb. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a critical inflection point. American daylight bombing raids were penetrating deeper into Germany, but at devastating cost. In October 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 186 heavy bombers during raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, nearly 2,000 aircrew killed or captured in a single month. The mathematics were brutal. At current loss rates, the entire heavy bomber force would be replaced through attrition every 3 months. The problem wasn't courage or training. The problem was physics and geography. P-47. Thunderbolts could escort bombers only as far as Western Germany before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. P-38. Lightnings had the range, but lacked high-altitude performance against the latest German fighters. That left a 400-mile gap from the German border to Berlin and beyond, where B-17s and B-24s flew without fighter protection. The Luftwaffe called it the happy hunting grounds. Then came the P-51 Mustang with its revolutionary Packard Merlin engine and laminar flow wing. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But arrival wasn't the same as dominance. The Mustang's official performance, specifications, top speed 437 xpx at 25,000 feet, climb rate 3,200 feet per minute, made it competitive with German fighters. Just competitive, not superior. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, described the tactical reality in his after-action reports. The FW-190 can outdive us below 20,000 feet. The Bf-109G can outclimb us above 25,000. We have range. They have performance where it matters. The statistics backed up the frustration. In January 1944, the kill ratio between 8th Air Force fighters and the Luftwaffe stood at 1.8 to 1, respectable, but not decisive. German pilots were positioning themselves above American formations, diving through at maximum speed, making a single firing pass, then climbing away before escorts could react. The Mustang's official war emergency power setting, 61 inches of manifold pressure for 5 minutes maximum, gave pilots a brief performance boost, but it wasn't enough to catch a diving FW-190 or pursue a climbing Bf-109. What made the situation particularly maddening was that engineers knew the Merlin engine had untapped potential. The V1657 variant produced 1,795 horsepower at war emergency power. But the same engine, running at higher manifold pressures with richer fuel mixtures, had produced over 2,000 horsepower on test stands. The limiting factor wasn't metallurgy or engineering. It was fuel octane rating and detonation risk. Standard 100-octane aviation fuel allowed the Merlin to operate at high compression ratios without pre-ignition. Push the manifold pressure higher, though, and the air-fuel mixture would detonate prematurely, hammering pistons and destroying engines in minutes. The solution existed: 150 grade fuel with a performance number of 150 for rich mixture conditions. This fuel could withstand the extreme pressures of combat power settings far beyond the engine's rated limits. But in early 1944, 150 fuel was scarce, reserved for British aircraft and specific high-priority missions. American fighters were still running on 130 grade fuel, adequate for specifications, inadequate for supremacy. Some squadron commanders started asking dangerous questions. If British Spitfires were already using 150 grade fuel for combat operations without catastrophic engine failures, why couldn't American Mustangs? If the Merlin could survive 75 inches of manifold pressure for short bursts in testing, why were combat pilots restricted to 61 inches? And most importantly, how many bombers were being lost because fighter escorts couldn't catch German attackers who knew exactly what performance limitations American pilots were operating under? The official answer from Wright Field was unambiguous. Unauthorized power settings would void aircraft warranties, violate technical orders, and result in disciplinary action. The unofficial answer from combat squadrons was about to be written in the skies over Germany. German fighter pilots had learned to respect the Mustang, but they hadn't learned to fear it. Luftwaffe intelligence had captured P-51s, tested them thoroughly, and documented their performance envelope precisely. The reports circulating through Jagdgeschwader units were specific: maximum speed 700 kilometers per hour at 8,000 meters. Climb rate adequate, but not exceptional above combat altitude. Dive speed limited by compressibility effects. The Mustang's thin wing would buffet severely above 500 mph indicated airspeed. More importantly, German pilots knew the Mustang's energy tactics. American fighters would engage at high speed, make a single pass, then extend away horizontally. They wouldn't dogfight. They wouldn't turn. They'd use their speed to dictate engagement terms, but they couldn't pursue a FW-190 in a dive or follow a BF-109 in a sustained climb above 25,000 feet. Oberstleutnant Walter Dahl, a veteran fighter commander with 84 confirmed kills, issued tactical guidance based on these assumptions. The Mustang is fast in level flight, but cannot sustain high climb rates at altitude. Engage from above, make your pass, then climb away at full power. They cannot follow. If pressed, split S and dive away. Their dive performance is inferior to the FW-190. These weren't arrogant assessments from inexperienced pilots. They were accurate observations based on documented American fighter performance. The Luftwaffe's intelligence arm had compiled performance charts showing exactly what every Allied fighter could and couldn't do. Those charts were right, as long as American pilots followed their technical orders. What German commanders didn't know was that those technical orders were being systematically ignored by desperate squadron commanders 20,000 feet over occupied Europe. The breaking point came in February 1944. During a massive raid on Leipzig, Luftwaffe fighters destroyed 21 bombers despite heavy escort presence. American fighter pilots filed after-action reports describing the same frustrating pattern: German fighters attacking from above, escaping into vertical climbs before escorts could close the distance. One P-51 pilot noted in his report, observed BF 109 in climb at approximately 27,000 feet, applied full war emergency power, and attempted pursuit. Enemy aircraft pulled away, climbing at estimated 4,500 feet per minute, unable to close distance. The mathematics were killing bomber crews. If escorts couldn't catch attackers, those attackers would make multiple passes. If German pilots could climb away from pursuit at will, they'd keep coming back until their ammunition ran out. The Mustang had solved the range problem. Pilots could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. But presence wasn't protection if German fighters could attack with impunity. Some squadron commanders started making quiet calculations. The official penalty for exceeding war emergency power limits was engine replacement and possible court-martial for willful destruction of government property. The unofficial penalty for following regulations was watching bombers burn. Then came reports from a handful of units, squadrons that seemed to be catching German fighters that should have escaped, recording kills at altitudes where Mustangs shouldn't have been able to sustain pursuit. Reports that mentioned manifold pressures that weren't supposed to be possible. The modified fuel experiments were already underway. Most pilots just didn't know it yet. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the high-octane fuel experiments that gave American fighters their decisive edge over Germany. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about these unauthorized power modifications before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The solution came from an unlikely alliance between desperate fighter pilots and maverick engineering officers who were willing to test regulations against combat reality. In late January 1944, several 8th Air Force fighter groups began receiving shipments of 150 grade fuel, officially designated for evaluation purposes, but quietly diverted from British stocks by supply officers who understood what was at stake. The 4th Fighter Group at Debden was among the first to run systematic tests. Colonel Don Blakesley personally flew the initial evaluation flights, pushing his Mustang to manifold pressures that would have horrified Wright field engineers. At 67 inches of manifold pressure, 6 inches beyond the war emergency power limit, his aircraft climbed at 4,200 feet per minute at 25,000 feet. At 75 inches, sustained for 2 minutes during a simulated combat climb, the climb rate exceeded 5,000 feet per minute, and the Merlin engine not only survived, it ran smoothly. The technical explanation was straightforward. The 150 fuel could withstand the extreme cylinder pressures created by high manifold pressure and rich mixture settings without detonating. This meant pilots could push throttles past the red line, past every warning in the technical manual, and the engine would deliver power that matched or exceeded what German fighters could produce. The risk wasn't eliminated. Sustained operation at these power settings would accelerate wear, increase oil consumption, and eventually require more frequent engine changes, but eventually meant 50 or 60 hours of flight time. In early 1944, fighter pilots were being shot down long before engines wore out. By March, the secret wasn't a secret anymore, at least not within combat squadrons. Crew chiefs were regularly filling Mustang tanks with 150 grade fuel. Pilots were being briefed on the new power settings during combat tactics sessions. The official technical orders remained unchanged. The unofficial tactical doctrine was spreading through the 8th Air Force like a brush fire. March 8, 1944. The day George Preddy flew his first combat mission with full 150 grade fuel loading, the 8th Air Force launched a maximum effort against Berlin, the Big B, the most heavily defended target in Germany. The bomber stream stretched for 200 miles, over 600 B-17s and B-24s, escorted by nearly 800 fighters. Preddy's flight of 4 Mustangs was cruising at 28,000 feet, 50 miles east of the German border, when the radio erupted with contact calls. Bombers under attack. FW-190s diving through the formation from 32,000 feet. The geometry was familiar and frustrating. German fighters positioned 4,000 feet higher, hitting the bombers in slashing vertical attacks, then climbing away before escorts could intercept. Preddy shoved his throttle forward to the unauthorized 75-inch manifold pressure setting and pulled his Mustang into a climbing turn toward the attack. The Merlin engine roared at 3,000 RPM, producing power that shouldn't have been possible. His airspeed held steady at 350 mph, even as his altimeter unwound upward. 29,000 feet, 30,000, 31,000. The Focke-Wulfs that should have been pulling away were still in sight. At 32,500 feet, Preddy rolled inverted and pulled through onto the tail of an FW-190 that had just completed its attack pass and was climbing away in a chandelle. The German pilot was following standard doctrine. Climb away at full power, knowing American escorts couldn't sustain pursuit at this altitude. But Preddy's Mustang wasn't following the performance curve that German intelligence had documented. At 75 inches of manifold pressure, the Merlin was producing nearly 2,100 horsepower. The P-51 was climbing at almost 5,500 feet per minute. The range closed from 800 yards to 400. The German pilot, checking his 6 o'clock position, saw what should have been impossible. A Mustang not only keeping pace but closing distance in a sustained climb above 30,000 feet. He broke hard left and dove, trying to use the FW-190's superior dive performance. Preddy followed, keeping his throttle at maximum power. His airspeed climbed through 450 mph, 475, approaching 500. The technical manual said the Mustang would buffet severely at these speeds. His aircraft stayed stable. At 27,000 feet, still in the dive, Preddy closed to 300 yards and opened fire with all 650 caliber Browning machine guns. The convergence was set for 250 yards. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds walked up the FW-190's fuselage, punched through the cockpit canopy, and blew fragments from the radial engine cowling. The German fighter rolled inverted and continued diving, streaming smoke and coolant. Preddy watched it fall away. No chute visible. The engagement lasted 90 seconds from initial climb to kill. Preddy's manifold pressure gauge showed 75 inches for the entire sequence. His cylinder head temperature was redlined. His oil temperature was climbing. None of it mattered. The FW-190 pilot had expected a Mustang that couldn't follow him above 30,000 feet. He'd gotten one that chased him down like a falcon on a sparrow. Across the sprawling air battle over Berlin that day, the story repeated itself dozens of times. 8th Air Force fighter pilots, flying with unauthorized fuel and unauthorized power settings, were catching German fighters that should have escaped. The Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters confirmed, with another 20 probables. American bomber losses were the lowest in weeks, 37 aircraft, horrific by any measure, but dramatically better than the 100-plus losses predicted for an unescorted Berlin raid. The after-action reports were carefully worded. Pilots described maximum continuous power and full combat settings without specifying exact manifold pressures. Crew chiefs logged engine hours but didn't mention fuel grades. Intelligence officers compiled kill claims without questioning how Mustangs were suddenly out-climbing Bf-109s at 28,000 feet. Wright Field's technical orders still said 61 inches maximum manifold pressure for 5 minutes. Combat squadrons over Germany were running 75 inches until the Germans were dead or they ran out of ammunition. The results settled the debate more decisively than any engineering analysis could have. The unofficial fuel experiments became official doctrine with remarkable speed once the combat results proved undeniable. By April 1944, Wright field engineers, some of whom had been secretly supporting the field tests despite official policy, released revised technical orders authorizing 75 inches of manifold pressure for combat emergency operations when using 150 grade fuel. The language was carefully crafted to avoid admitting that combat squadrons had been violating regulations for months. The new limit was presented as a recent engineering breakthrough rather than a validation of unauthorized testing. The technical analysis revealed exactly why the modification worked so effectively. The Packard Merlin V1650 SAW-7 engine produced 1,695 horsepower at the original 61-inch war emergency power setting. At 75 inches with 150 grade fuel, the same engine generated 2,218 horsepower, a 31% increase in power output. At 25,000 feet in combat configuration, this translated to a maximum speed increase from 437 mph to 478 nm and a climb rate improvement from 3,200 feet per minute to over 5,000 feet per minute. The performance gap that had frustrated American pilots evaporated. A Bf-109G6, previously capable of outclimbing a Mustang above 25,000 feet, now found itself being overtaken. The FW-190A-8, which could escape pursuit by diving away at speeds above 450 mph, discovered that modified Mustangs could match those dive speeds without the control buffeting that older performance charts predicted. Engine wear increased, exactly as the conservative engineering estimates had warned. Mustangs running sustained high-power operations required engine overhauls every 60-80 hours instead of every 100 to 120 hours. Piston rings wore faster. Exhaust valves required more frequent inspection. But engines that lasted 60 hours protected bombers for 60 hours. Engines that stayed within conservative limits protected nothing if the pilots flying them couldn't catch enemy fighters. Lieutenant Colonel Edward B. Giller, 8th Air Force Engineering Staff Officer, wrote in his May 1944 technical assessment, "The operational advantage gained by high-power operations using 150 grade fuel far exceeds the maintenance cost. Fighter groups using authorized combat emergency power settings are recording kill ratios of 3.5.1 against the Luftwaffe, compared to 1.8.1 for groups still operating under conservative power limitations." The psychological impact on German fighter pilots proved as significant as the performance numbers. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine had been built on documented assumptions about Allied fighter capabilities. When those assumptions suddenly became invalid, when Mustangs started appearing where they shouldn't, climbing faster than intelligence charts said they could, sustaining speeds that shouldn't have been possible, the doctrinal foundation crumbled. German after-action reports from spring 1944 show mounting confusion. One Bf-109 pilot described a March engagement. Attacked bomber formation from 9,000 meters, made firing pass, climbed away at full power. American Mustang followed in sustained climb. Could not shake pursuit above 8,500 meters. Previously, American fighters could not maintain this performance. By May 1944, the fuel modification doctrine had spread to every American fighter group in Europe. P-47 Thunderbolts, using the same 150 grade fuel in their turbocharged radial engines, were pushing manifold pressures from 52 inches to 65 inches for combat operations. P-38 Lightnings received similar modifications. The performance boost was universal across American fighter types, but the impact was most dramatic in the Mustang, where the Merlin engine's response to high-octane fuel turned a competitive fighter into a dominant one. The captured German technical intelligence documents from late 1944 show the Luftwaffe scrambling to understand what had changed. They knew American fighters were faster than before. They didn't know why. The answer, that combat squadrons had ignored engineering limits and proven those limits were artificially conservative, never appeared in German intelligence assessments. They were measuring the effect without understanding the cause. And by the time they realized what had happened, the air war over Europe was already lost. The statistical evidence of the fuel modification's impact is written in blood and burning aircraft across the skies of 1944. Between March and June, the period when high-octane fuel use became standard across 8th Air. Force fighter groups, the kill ratio between American fighters and the Luftwaffe, climbed from 1.8.1 to 4.2.1. Bomber loss rates dropped from 4.5% per mission to 1.8% per mission. The Luftwaffe lost over 2,200 fighters during this period, including hundreds of veteran pilots whose experience couldn't compensate for aircraft performance they'd been trained to expect but no longer faced. George Preddy, who flew that March 8th combat mission with unauthorized fuel, went on to become the top-scoring P-51 ace in the European theater with 26.83 confirmed kills. He credited the high-power modifications with saving his life repeatedly. When you're at 30,000 feet and a 109 is climbing away from you, the difference between 61 inches and 75 inches of manifold pressure is the difference between watching him escape and putting him in your gun sight. Preddy was killed on December 25, 1944, not by German fighters, but by American anti-aircraft fire during a low-altitude pursuit, a victim of friendly fire, not enemy technology. The engineering legacy proved even more significant than the immediate combat results. The fuel experiments demonstrated that Allied radial and inline engines had been conservatively rated for peacetime reliability standards that didn't apply to combat operations. Post-war analysis showed that accepting reduced engine life in exchange for higher performance was a mathematically favorable trade in combat conditions where airframe attrition exceeded engine attrition by factors of 5 to 1. This doctrine influenced post-war military aircraft development fundamentally. The concept of combat emergency power, accepting reduced engine life for critical performance when survival depends on it, became standard in jet fighters, attack aircraft, and even modern combat helicopters. The F-4 Phantom's water injection system, the F-15's afterburner, and countless other military power augmentation systems trace their doctrinal lineage back to those Mustang pilots who pushed their throttles past red lines over Germany. The British Royal Air Force, which had been using 100-150 grade fuel in Spitfires and Tempests throughout the war, watched the American experimentation with bemused interest. RAF test pilot Captain Eric Brown later noted, "The Americans had to rediscover operationally what we'd already proven in testing, that the Merlin could take far more abuse than Rolls-Royce's peacetime engineering margins suggested. The difference was that American pilots proved it in combat, which settled the debate rather more definitively than any test report could. The irony wasn't lost on aviation historians. The United States, with the world's most abundant petroleum resources and most advanced refining capacity, initially restricted its fighter pilots to lower-grade fuel for bureaucratic and liability reasons, while British pilots, fighting with limited resources, routinely used the better fuel from the beginning. The American advantage in industrial capacity was nearly wasted by peacetime procurement thinking that took months to adapt to wartime reality. By late 1944, 100-150 grade fuel production in the United States exceeded British production by a factor of 8. The limiting factor had never been availability. It had been authorization. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you. It's the regulations written by people who aren't. The story of the fuel modifications reveals a truth that extends far beyond piston engines and octane ratings. Institutional caution, however well-intentioned, calculates risk differently than the people actually facing the consequences. Engineers at Wright Field were protecting engines. Pilots over Germany were protecting bombers carrying 10 men each. The engineers weren't wrong about accelerated wear or reduced service life. They were just solving the wrong problem. Innovation under pressure doesn't wait for authorization. When squadron commanders started filling their Mustangs with 150-grade fuel in violation of technical orders, they weren't being reckless. They were being empirical. They tested, observed, measured, and adjusted based on what actually happened rather than what was supposed to happen. The scientific method, applied at 28,000 feet by men whose lives depended on getting the answer right. The margin between victory and defeat in the air war over Europe turned out to be 14 inches of manifold pressure and a willingness to question whether the limits in the manual were physical laws or administrative preferences. German fighter pilots were skilled, experienced, and flying excellent aircraft. They lost anyway, not because American pilots were better trained or more courageous, but because American pilots had 500 extra horsepower when it mattered most. March 8, 1944. One fuel truck, one unauthorized modification, one pilot who decided that survival mattered more than compliance. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is trust the evidence in front of him more than the regulations behind him. And sometimes 14 inches of manifold pressure is the difference between watching the enemy escape and bringing him down. The Luftwaffe never knew what hit them. They were flying against aircraft performance that wasn't supposed to exist. By the time they figured it out, their best pilots were already dead. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II aviation that deserve to be remembered. From the test pilots who pushed experimental aircraft beyond their limits to the ground crews who kept them flying against impossible odds. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? The P-38's compressibility problems that killed dozens of pilots before the solution was found. The Soviet ace who flew an American P-39 Airacobra to 48 kills. Let me know in the comments below.